Alright guys, talk about the Formula 1 news as more engines are getting fired up for 2026. New rumours emerging that Ferrari could be better positioned than originally thought in terms of their power unit development and certainly the fuel that will be going into it for the upcoming season. Certainly though, only one piece of the puzzle in 2026. Very much enjoyed your thoughts on the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Lewis Hamilton's 41st birthday today. We're going to start here though because Gianpiero Lambiase, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, had interest following the season from Aston Martin, from Williams, potentially from McLaren as well. Now, Eric Van Haren yesterday said, nothing to worry about for now if you are a Max Verstappen or Red Bull fan. GP is not going anywhere. But he did make it clear that while yes, he has a contract until the end of 2027, it is not guaranteed he stays forever. Van Haren basically said yes, he will stay for now, but did not say much more. And there was an article here from the guys at Auto Racer that suggested that the offer from Aston Martin is especially compelling. It's not enough yet to make this happen, and also given potential gardening leave relationships, it's pretty unlikely that they would just be able to yoink GP or yoink him straight out of Red Bull and into Aston Martin with a couple of months notice. But potentially for 2027, it's not something that can be ruled out. Lambiase remains at the Red Bull in 26, but the Aston offer is concrete also for the subsequent years. Newey is redesigning the team with numerous layoffs, and Lambiase is a figure highly esteemed by the British genius, of course referring in this case to Newey. This is just a snippet of the article. I'll leave the entire thing down below if you guys want to check it out. There's a few interesting things that were said here. It was never in doubt that he was going to stay at Red Bull. That a professional like Lambiase would be interested to several teams, including Aston, is not surprising either. With the arrival of Newey, a new era has begun. Lawrence Stroll has given the British genius carte blanche, and using a process very similar to the one he implemented at Red Bull, has begun a massive layoff campaign to shape the team in his image and likeness. Now, we have seen this in recent months, right? Newey from the outside might look like a pretty kind, gentle individual. I'm sure that he is in his private life. But professionally, he is an extremely competitive individual. And as a result, if Newey is given the power to hire and fire at will, effectively, which he has been given the power and the ownership and equity to do so by Lawrence Stroll, that's what he's going to do. So since coming into Aston Martin, Newey has made some big decisions. We understand there may have been some disagreement with the way that things were with Mike Crack and Andy Cowell and all of that state of affairs, in addition to the arrival of Enrico Cardile from Ferrari and many other individuals behind the scenes, some of which have been moved into different positions, some of which have been let go. Maybe others have been brought on as well, but effectively Newey is cleaning house in a certain regard and restructuring the team in a way that he believes is best suited to the future success of Aston Martin. Lawrence Stroll has given him the freedom to do exactly that, which certainly he wouldn't have had at a team like Ferrari, which he was linked to for some time. Now, Newey has apparently also employed a trusted person, what you might call like a mole, really. Someone who is keeping a very close eye on what's happening in the factory, because Newey can't do it all. He can't design the car and monitor everything that's happening internally. So he's basically chosen somebody to be his inside man in all of the factory pieces to kind of report back to him what's working well, what isn't, who's causing problems, who isn't, this type of stuff. So look, this could be very effective management from Newey. Time will tell whether this is an effective operation, but it's very clear that things in Aston Martin are hierarchical, right? It's not that there's, everyone's on the same level. Of course, every organization is like this to a degree, but Newey is the figurehead and is making all the decisions right now, and we'll see if that works out for the better. I think it's got as good a chance as any solution, really, for Aston Martin to get where they want to be. So some key figures have left. There's also other second and third tier, basically second and third rate engineers that are now joining rival teams because Newey sacked them effectively in recent months, because more engineers and more stuff is not necessarily better if they are wasting time on big problems. But what was also described in the article was, as the guys say here, Aston Martin wants GP. Newey's a big fan of him. He would like him to come in a CEO / team principal kind of role, because while Newey is technically the TP, he's not going to do all of that kind of commercial public-facing stuff. And also operationally, Newey's still got a car to design at the end of the day. So they want GP. It's not going to happen yet, but for 2027 and certainly beyond, there is absolutely a compelling offer on the table. And if Red Bull don't start the season very well, it all looks like it could be part of Aston Martin's plan. So it's very interesting, the ship that Newey is leading behind the scenes right now. It's actually one of the more fascinating teams, probably the most fascinating. I think there's lots of excitement about Williams right now, and for good reason. But as I said the other day, as much as Williams are an exciting team, they are still a Mercedes-powered team that you wouldn't expect them to start overhauling Mercedes all of a sudden. So, look, Williams might move forward in the pecking order, but they're unlikely to win a championship in the next couple of years, whereas Aston Martin, kind of anything goes, given they've got this Honda powertrain that nobody else has. So, yeah, Newey wants Lambiase. He wants him at some point, and if Newey wants it to happen, Lawrence Stroll will give him the resources to make that kind of deal happen if Lambiase is open to it, which presumably he is, just not immediately. He's been offered a team principal or a CEO position for 2027. This is still absolutely possible. We did see today the footage of the first fire-up of the new Audi engine. So Audi, of course, have their own engine this year, which is different to, let's say, Cadillac. They're using Ferrari. Other teams are using Mercedes. And the engine does work. It's been fired up. I'll just share the clip for you guys right now so you can have a listen to it for the first time. But look, if you're an Audi fan, they do have an engine which starts. The team were pretty happy about that. But of course, big questions on what their competitiveness looks like, and also reliability concerns when we turn up to Barcelona. As is described, many teams are worried, for good reason, about the reliability of these engines. This is the biggest change in Formula One regulations that we've ever seen. Usually it's either chassis or it's engine. Right now it's both, and both quite radically at that. These engines are very different to before in terms of the way that they're going to behave. They're also very different in some regard in terms of the regulation on how to build them. Look, there's still a 1.6 litre displacement V6 with a turbo attached, but in some respects they're quite different. And the way that they will need to perform, especially given the massive battery, is also rather different as well. No MGU-H, it's only an MGU-K. And there's concerns about reliability, especially when it comes to the compression ratio has been mandatedly reduced from 18:1 to 16:1, but we believe Mercedes and potentially Red Bull have a way around that, which could generate up to 13 more horsepower is the rumour, potentially 3 to 4 tenths of a second a lap. There is advantage in that. So that could be a big deal, but also Ferrari using these steel cylinder heads, they believe that's going to mean they can run their engine harder to potentially make up for that deficit, but also is that going to make it rather unreliable? Of course, every time you see engine regulation changes, the reliability goes down. And in recent Formula One years, the reliability from a mechanical perspective has been stellar. Most championships pre-2010 probably were decided in large regard, of course not always, but there were many championships that were effectively decided by reliability, even 2016, Malaysia with Hamilton, etc. So look, often championships are decided as such. In recent years, we've kind of got used to the cars just kind of finishing the race. This year, the only really big notable mechanical problem was for Lando in Zandvoort, but apart at least of the top contenders. But apart from that, it was relatively good running. And, you look at the occasional mechanical issues that Mercedes had, like Alonso in Monaco and Antonelli in Imola and some other few ones, and they stick out because they're rare. Whereas in previous generations of F1, you wouldn't even be able to remember them all because there would just be too many for the top contenders. Now, I'm not expecting reliability to fall to the level that we had when, the turbos were first introduced in that kind of era. But the reliability mechanical failure rate will not be, 5%, right? It's in 2%. It's going to be higher than that this season. And of course, there's other reasons to DNF as well. So concerns are there about the performance of the power units. Of course, Audi have even themselves admitted they're not going to have the fastest engine. For them, it's about trying to take some steps forward. Now, it's also worthy of note, these engines are not frozen in their development. There's actually a permission that says, okay, after 6 races, we are going to test the engines because the FIA has their own version of all of those engines on their test bed. The fastest engine, let's say it's the Mercedes, if the teams are if they're outside of 2% of performance, they get an extra upgrade. They can bring an homologation to their engine over time. And if they're 4% outside, then they can bring 2 in that period. They get more money, more opportunities to develop the engine. So the intention is in the coming years to allow teams to catch up, which is, of course, in 2014 not really possible. Mercedes led the way. They kept leading the way, and then they effectively kept leading the way. So this year, who's going to be the concerning one from a reliability perspective? Are we going to see races like this again? I'm not saying I'm looking forward to it, but it's certainly going to be dramatic, right? I mean, this, for example, is the Australian Grand Prix 1995. You can look back at a number of Grand Prix from, it's the mid-90s, but you look back at some Grand Prix in the early 80s or like late 70s and stuff. The DNF rate was out of control, right? This race, Mika Hakkinen didn't even start it. But look at the amount of retirements, and appreciate that some of these, they spun off, like Barrichello, collision damage with Schumacher and Alesi this race. But I mean, look at this, right? Engine problem, drive shaft problem for Johnny Herbert, engine for Eddie Irvine, gearbox for Frentzen, engine for Berger, right? Coulthard had an accident, but gearbox issues, electrical issues, right? I mean, there were 8 drivers that finished the race, and one of them was lapped 5 times. Damon Hill won the race by 2 laps from Olivier Panis in second, right? So, yeah, quite the race for sure. But could we go back to an era where you have it, 5-6 cars DNFing every single Grand Prix at the start? The question, I think, for many is we're going to see a little bit of this at testing, right? Ferrari have practically said they will bring a Spec A car for Barcelona where they are going to make sure their engine works and it runs and they get some laps in. Of course, that is easier said than done, regardless of all the other complications with these cars, certainly when it comes to active aero and the like. Not sure what a Nicolas Maduro edit is doing here, but just a little prediction, really, on what day one could look like in terms of testing. Russell 186 laps, Norris 163, Sainz, Gasly, all, of course, in this hypothetical scenario in Mercedes power. I think these would be pretty impressive numbers to hit anyway, if these get anywhere close to these numbers. Then Leclerc, maybe good news for Ferrari if this is the case. Bearman in the Haas, then we've got Alonso 1. So, look, it's almost certain that one of the teams, their engine is going to struggle from a reliability perspective. Mercedes, you would say, is the least likely to suffer with this, just given what we've seen historically. But I think Ferrari, Audi, Honda. Obviously, there's also Red Bull powertrains. Kind of anything really goes, and it's tough to predict in this sense. This is also just worthy of note on the chassis side, just because I've not really shared this recently. These are the testing and wind tunnel allocations in CFD and wind tunnel that the teams are permitted. McLaren being first gets 70% of the allocation. The 100% is given to the 7th place team, which ended up being Aston Martin. So again, one of the reasons that you've got to have some confidence that Aston could do some damage, right? Because they're in 7th. They get a lot more allocation than the top teams do, despite currently having pretty similar, you would think, resources. So, again, some exciting teams to watch. It's Audi and Cadillac. They get tied with Alpine, effectively, given that they were right at the back of the field and new entries coming in some regard. But let's talk about Ferrari, right? They finished 4th in the championship this year. They were 2nd last year by a smidge. This year, they fell way back. The car was awful. But as a result, they do have more testing time for the chassis. And that could be more of an advantage now than ever, right? I mean, if you think about it, if you were, let's say, an extra 10-15% allocation last year, okay, great, but you're towards the end of the reg cycle, so what are you going to discover in that extra 10-15% of hours? Probably not that much, really, when you're reaching the ceiling of what your concept is capable of. But arguably right now, I mean, if you're Alpine, if you're Audi, Cadillac, you've got basically 50% more, more than that, allocation than the leaders of the championship have. And right now, that probably goes further, given the development curve, than it would have done before. So arguably for Ferrari, if there was ever a time to be 4th, it's better for it to be in the last year so that you get that advantage into a new reg cycle, right? I think we've definitely seen this allocation in recent years has led us to a more competitive field, but maybe this year we're really going to start to see that, given that rate of development, which could be possible. But on the engine side, that is one of the key questions. So in recent days, we've talked about this steel cylinder head versus aluminium option, and not exactly sure where this came from, but there was this post that did the rounds, which is clearly ChatGPT generated, if you read through it. But it talks about steel versus aluminium and the reliability and the other possibilities, the pros, effectively the benefits of Ferrari doing this. And apparently an ICE Ferrari engineer actually liked this post, so kind of gave it the green light to say, almost from the inside of Ferrari, yes, that is what we are doing. These are the advantages we are seeking to yield, and this is why they've made the call. Now, again, there are clever engineers, all of these teams. The other teams, if they're going aluminium, they will have their reasons for doing that as well. It doesn't seem evident that there's going to be a massive performance advantage from using steel, because otherwise everyone would be doing it. But look, Ferrari, their ability to create good engines, at least powerful engines, that is not a matter for debate. Reliability is the more concerning piece, but steel could actually provide some advantages there, depending on, of course, how it is produced. But it seems like that is what Ferrari are doing, which is different to other teams, and clearly this guy behind the scenes felt like this is the way to gain advantage over the rivals. The other possibility that's worthy of talking about in a little bit more detail is the fuel components, because it's not often a talking point in F1 lately, but it certainly will be relevant this season. If you guys haven't heard us talking about this before on the channel, next year the fuels have to be 100% sustainable, but they can either be synthetic hydrocarbons, which is what Aramco are doing, and probably Mercedes, ExxonMobil, and the other manufacturers too, but we don't really know yet, BP as well. Shell have been quite clear they are going down a sustainable biofuel approach using waste products effectively, and as long as they are not using any fossil fuels and it's better for the environment by like 65% or however they generate the numbers, then that is fine. Now, Aramco have been considered to have an edge here because they have been designing these fuels and have the experience making the e-fuels, the synthetic fuels, in F2 for quite some time now. So of the e-fuel providers, Aramco should be expected to have an advantage over Petronas and others, you would presume. But it's also worth noting here that all of those engine or fuel suppliers that I just mentioned, none of them are in IndyCar apart from Shell. Now, Shell has been providing 100% renewable biofuel in IndyCar for now the last couple of years. Now, there is a bit of nuance here, right? I did a bit of digging into this, kind of came to the conclusion that is as follows. But IndyCar's fuels, yes, they are renewable, but they are ethanol-based in a different way. Now, they're still, to some degree, renewable biofuels, but the way that they interact, the engines, the way that they are compressed, many of the physical elements of the way that the fuel is actually used and the way that it's constructed is going to be quite radically different. So the conclusion seems to be that from an operational practicality perspective, Shell do have an edge here over the others, especially because, they're the only team to, or the only engine fuel supplier to be in IndyCar compared to all the others. That should be an advantage from like a reliability, from an operational perspective. They will have more on that than anybody else will. But it's worthy to note that the F2 sustainable fuels are far closer from a molecular perspective to what's going to be used in F1, at least on the e-fuel side. But as I say, given we don't think that the other suppliers are really doing too much biofuel stuff, so the conclusion seems to be, out of all of this, probably Aramco are best positions, but Shell should have an edge over the other manufacturers because of this IndyCar relationship. So it's just another small component which leans in Ferrari's favour. There are many different pieces to this puzzle, of course. I mean, look, one missed trick on a floor end plate or like a wing end plate that outdoes all the hard work of a good engine or a bad engine or whatever. So there's so many pieces here. But there's at least reason for Ferrari fans to believe that there are some elements in their court which give them some sort of edge. Whether that's going to be enough, given the potential advantage of other teams, that's a good question. Just one final thing I wanted to mention to close out with. I've never really heard this talked about much before, but it is an interesting observation. So David Coulthard was talking about the state of affairs at McLaren and how if there is a decision to be made which undermines one of the drivers, as in it's some sort of team order, he thinks that call should never be coming from the race engineer of the driver. It should be something that only comes from the team boss or some other figure, right? So, for example, when Valtteri is told to yield in Zandvoort, it's James Vowles who comes on the radio. It's not his race engineer. If there's some sort of team order that involves the drivers, it might be Toto Wolff or even Horner comes on the radio. Not like that would necessarily be the case at Red Bull often. They kind of know the drill over there. But at McLaren, given they did this whole, well, we're both number one type situation, cool. I'm not going to read through Coulthard's quote, but you can, feel free to kind of read through it. But effectively what he says is the relationship between the driver and the engineer has to be unbreakable. So you never want to feel like your engineer, who's meant to be your absolute diehard right-hand man soldier there in the warfare with you, you never want to feel like he's undermining you. You always want to feel that he has your back no matter what. So if there's a decision to be made on like, all right, you're going to have to yield. I mean, really, what comes to mind for me is Hungary in 2024, when Will Joseph was clearly getting told by the team to be on the radio to Lando to be basically gaslighting him, right? About how, you need Oscar, it's a team game and all of this. Like, oh, Lando, you've made your point and all that. Like, that absolute embarrassment that McLaren did that day. Effectively, they were telling Lando in a roundabout way to yield to Oscar and give Oscar the win, which he eventually did, and it was controversial, and we saw the repercussions of that the following season in 2025 as well. But Coulthard's point is, if you're going to do that to your driver, if you are going to do such a team order, it should not be their race engineer on the radio making that call, because that just destabilizes the environment. So I thought that was a pretty good observation, really, and something that maybe McLaren need to think about going forwards, especially if they're going to keep up this whole papaya rule situation, which they say they absolutely will. So very much enjoyed your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.